Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today we're tackling an important and timely book, The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America by Timothy Snyder. It's quite a dense read, but it offers, I think, some really valuable insights into the rise of authoritarianism and how it threatens democracies all around the world.
Yeah, it's definitely not light reading.
Yeah.
But I think it's essential reading for anyone who's concerned about, the state of global affairs today.
I agree. And Snyder really meticulously unpacks how Russia, transitioned from that hopeful post-Soviet era to what he calls eternal political stagnation under Putin. And he makes a compelling case for how this shift has major implications for democracy, not just within Russia's borders, but, he's talking about Europe, he's talking about America, he's talking about the global landscape.
One of the things I found so fascinating about this book is how Snyder connects these seemingly disparate events of the 2010s, things like Russia's actions in Ukraine, the rise of populism in the West, Brexit, the Trump election. He weaves them together to show how this trend toward illiberalism is interconnected and really poses a significant threat to the values that we in the West often take for granted.
All right, so let's dive into the heart of this book, starting with chapter 1. It's called Individualism or Totalitarianism. And Snyder kicks things off by exploring this concept he calls the politics of eternity. It's a really powerful idea. And to understand it, we need to go back to a specific historical tragedy, the Smolensk plane crash in 2010. Now, just to remind everyone, a Polish delegation, including the president, was on its way to commemorate the Katyn massacre, a Soviet crime from World War II, and their plane tragically crashed in Russia.
It was a horrific event. And, the crash itself was undeniably a tragedy. But what Snyder highlights is how it was used in Russia. Instead of becoming a moment for genuine reflection and reconciliation, a chance to really grapple with the dark chapters of history, it was twisted into a tool for propaganda.
Yeah, and Snyder uses this Smolensk tragedy at an entry point into understanding how the politics of eternity operates. He argues that in this framework, truth is fluid. History is manipulated to serve the needs of those in power, and there's this constant sense of grievance and victimhood that's used to justify aggression and authoritarianism.
It's a way of looking at the world where there's no real sense of progress or moving forward. It's all about clinging to a mythical past, a time of perceived greatness, and constantly battling against enemies both real and imagined who threaten that idealized vision.
And to understand how this plays out in Russia, Snyder points us to a somewhat obscure but incredibly influential figure, Ivan Ilyin. Now, Ilyin was a Russian philosopher who died in the 1950s, but his ideas have experienced a resurgence under Putin.
Ilyin was a proponent of a kind of Christian fascism. He envisioned Russia as this eternally innocent nation, destined to be led by a strong, almost messianic leader, someone who embodied the will of the people and would restore Russia to its rightful place on the world stage.
Right, and of course, that's how Putin wants to be seen, as that larger-than-life figure, the savior of Russia. And Snyder argues that Ilyin's ideology leaves absolutely no room for things like succession, that peaceful transfer of power that's so fundamental to healthy democracy.
Exactly, and that lack of a clear succession plan forces Putin into this corner, where he has to constantly manufacture crises to justify his hold on power. And we see this pattern play out time and time again. He uses these crises, whether real or fabricated, to consolidate his control and present himself as the indispensable leader, the only one who can protect Russia from its enemies.
And as we saw with the Smolensk crash, those crises can be based on manipulated history, twisted narratives, and often outright fiction. It's a playbook that Putin has used to great effect both domestically and on the international stage.
It's a really dangerous game, because when you're constantly relying on crisis and conflict to maintain your power, it creates this cycle of instability and aggression that can be very difficult to break out of.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another crucial concept that Snyder introduces early on, the idea of succession or failure. He argues that the ability to peacefully transfer power from one leader to the next is a cornerstone of democratic institutions. Without it, you have stagnation, you have a concentration of power, and ultimately, you have the potential for collapse.
It's one of the key differences between a democracy and an authoritarian regime. Democracies have mechanisms in place for the peaceful transfer of power. Authoritarian regimes don't. And that's why they're so often prone to instability and violence.
And Snyder contrasts this with what he calls the politics of inevitability. This is the idea that there is no alternative to the current system, that things can only get worse, and that any attempt to change the status quo is futile. It's a very cynical and ultimately disempowering worldview that feeds right into the hands of authoritarian leaders.
It's a way of thinking that can really paralyze people and prevent them from taking action to improve their lives.
So with this understanding of the politics of eternity and the crucial role of succession, we start to see how the stage is set for Russia's slide towards unfreedom. But Snyder doesn't stop there. He goes on to connect this internal dynamic to Russia's actions on the world stage, particularly its relationship with Europe and the West.
And that's where things get even more interesting, especially when we start looking at Chapter 3, integration or empire. Because here Snyder contrasts the European Union's model of integration, which is based on cooperation, shared values, and this idea of moving forward together, with Russia's imperial ambitions, this desire to reclaim its lost glory and reassert its dominance over its neighbors.
It's a clash of visions, really. On one hand, you have the EU, which, despite its flaws, represents this attempt to build a more peaceful and prosperous future through collaboration and the rule of law. And on the other hand, you have Putin's Russia, which seems stuck in this zero-sum game, this belief that any gain for the West is automatically a loss for Russia.
And to understand this mindset, we need to dig a little deeper into the intellectual and ideological currents that have shaped Putin's worldview. And that brings us to another key figure in Snyder's analysis, Alexander Dugin.
Ah, yes. Now, he is a fascinating, albeit controversial figure. He's a philosopher and political strategist who's been described as Putin's brain, although the extent of his direct influence is debated.
Dugin is a proponent of Eurasianism, this idea that Russia represents a distinct civilization, separate from both Europe and Asia. He believes that Russia has a unique destiny, a historical mission to lead a Eurasian empire that will challenge the dominance of the West.
And his ideas are rooted in a rejection of liberalism, democracy, individualism, all of which he sees as Western constructs that are alien to Russia's true identity. He advocates for a more authoritarian, traditionalist, and ultimately illiberal system that draws on Russia's imperial past.
It's a very romanticized view of history that ignores the very real suffering and oppression that were inflicted on millions of people under Russian imperial rule.
Yeah, it's important to keep that in mind. Now, while Dugin might be considered fringe in some circles, his ideas have definitely found fertile ground in Russia, particularly among nationalist and conservative intellectuals. And Snyder argues that his influence can be seen in Russia's increasingly aggressive foreign policy, particularly towards Ukraine.
And I think we can see the influence of these ideas in the rhetoric that's coming out of the Kremlin today. This talk of Russia's special mission, its destiny to lead a new world order, it's all very much in line with Dugin's thinking.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the key concepts and historical figures that Snyder uses to frame his analysis. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll look at how these ideas played out in practice, particularly in the events leading up to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. So stay tuned for that.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Picking up where we left off, 2013 was a really pivotal year. Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine at the time, he was kind of caught between this promise of closer ties with the EU and pressure from Putin to join the Eurasian Union. Talk about being between a rock and a hard place.
Oh, absolutely. He was in a tough spot trying to play both sides. But, under immense pressure from Moscow, he ultimately backed out of that EU agreement. And this decision, it ignited the Maidan protests in Kyiv. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians taking to the streets, demanding closer ties with Europe and, a decisive end to the corruption that had plagued the country.
And this is where that politics of eternity that Snyder keeps coming back to, it really takes center stage. The protests in Ukraine, similar to those we saw in Russia a few years earlier, they were portrayed on Russian state media, not as, a genuine expression of the people's will, but as a Western orchestrated coup. They even went as far as deliberately linking the protests to homosexuality, tapping into those deeply rooted prejudices and fears that unfortunately still hold sway in some segments of society.
It was a classic case of using propaganda to demonize opponents, to paint them as puppets of some nefarious foreign power, twisting the narrative to fit their agenda. And sadly, as we know, this set the stage for Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Right, and the annexation of Crimea was swift and brutal. And the way Russia used this combination of military force and disinformation to justify their actions, it's just staggering. I mean, the referendum that was held in Crimea, which was, used to legitimize the annexation, it was a complete sham. It had zero international legitimacy, but it was presented on Russian state media as this genuine outpouring of the Crimean people's desire to join Russia. It's crazy how effective that propaganda campaign was, fueled by this constant barrage of lies and conspiracy theories.
It really highlights the power of controlling the narrative. You know, when you can shape the information that people are exposed to, you can really manipulate their perceptions and their beliefs.
And Snyder dives deep into how Russian state media, under the leadership of Dmitry Kiselev, deliberately blurred the lines between news and fiction.
Kiselev, who headed the Russian state-owned media, famously said, "Objectivity is a myth." He saw his role not as reporting the truth, but as shaping a narrative that served the Kremlin's interests. He was a master manipulator of information.
And this manipulation wasn't limited to traditional media. Russia also engaged in sophisticated cyber warfare, hacking into Ukrainian government and media websites, spreading disinformation through social media, creating this climate of fear and uncertainty.
It was a full-spectrum assault on information, designed to confuse and disorient the population, and make it difficult to distinguish between truth and falsehood.
The downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 in July 2014 by a Russian-supplied missile is just a chilling example of how this disinformation campaign worked. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence, Russian state media relentlessly peddled these outlandish conspiracy theories, blaming Ukraine, even claiming that the plane is full of corpses planted by the CIA.
It's almost unbelievable, right? It seems their goal wasn't necessarily to convince everyone, but to create enough confusion and doubt, to make it difficult to establish a clear narrative and hold Russia accountable.
And unfortunately, that strategy proved to be pretty successful. The West imposed sanctions, but there was no unified, decisive response. Russia's actions ultimately went largely unpunished.
It's a sobering reminder that the international community often struggles to respond effectively to these kinds of hybrid threats, where you have a combination of military force disinformation and cyber warfare.
Absolutely. And what's even more chilling is that these same tactics that were used in Ukraine, disinformation, cyber warfare, the blurring of truth and lies, they were soon turned on Western democracies themselves. Snyder shows how Russian propaganda targeted the 2016 Brexit referendum and the U.S. presidential election that same year.
It's a really disturbing example of how these tactics can be used to undermine democratic processes from within.
And we'll delve into that in more detail in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've been talking about how Russia used these really sophisticated tactics in Ukraine, and now we're going to look at how those tactics were used against Western democracies themselves, right?
Right. And, in chapters 5 and 6, Snyder really meticulously details how Russia targeted both the 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK and the U.S. presidential election that same year. And it's, it's pretty sobering. It's a look at how vulnerable even these, well-established democracies can be to this kind of information warfare.
It's pretty alarming how effectively they applied the same playbook they used in Ukraine to these very different contexts. Their goal wasn't necessarily to dictate a specific outcome, but rather to amplify those divisions that were already there, create chaos, and just weaken these democratic systems from within.
Yeah, exactly. And, in the case of Brexit, Russia actively supported the Leave campaign, and they did this through, social media bots and troll farms spreading disinformation and really, exploiting the anxieties that already existed around things like immigration and national sovereignty. It was all about kind of deepening those fractures in British society and weakening the EU as a whole.
Yeah, it's like they took advantage of the fact that people were already feeling uncertain and divided, and they just poured fuel on the fire.
Exactly.
And then when we look at the 2016 U.S. presidential election, Russia's interference was even more brazen.
Yeah.
I mean, they hacked into the Democratic National Committee's servers, strategically releasing emails to inflict maximum damage on Hillary Clinton's campaign.
And it went far beyond just hacking. They really weaponized social media, spreading fake news, creating divisive content that played on these existing, racial and political tensions. And they even organized rallies and protests, often disguised behind these fake accounts and these online personas. It was, highly coordinated and multifaceted, campaign designed to just sow discord and undermine faith in the democratic process.
And what's even more concerning, I think, is that they didn't act alone. They found collaborators within the U.S. individuals who, for their own reasons, were willing to amplify Russian propaganda and contribute to the discord.
Yeah, Snyder, highlights figures like Stephen Cohen, a prominent American academic who consistently downplayed Russia's aggression and often echoed Kremlin talking points. And he also discusses how certain media outlets, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unwittingly, became conduits for Russian disinformation. It's this complex web of actors that makes it so difficult to counter this type of information warfare.
It really is. The impact of this interference is still being debated.
Yeah.
But it's clear that Russia's actions had a corrosive effect on American democracy. I mean, it eroded trust in institutions, it fueled political polarization, and it really left many Americans questioning the integrity of their own elections.
Right, and Snyder makes this, thought-provoking argument that America's own history of inequality and its embrace of this politics of inevitability, this idea that, there's no alternative to the current system, made it particularly vulnerable to this kind of manipulation.
Yeah, he suggests that when people are struggling economically, when they feel like the system isn't working for them, they become more susceptible to conspiracy theories and these simplistic, often divisive solutions that, make them more likely to support someone like Donald Trump, who promised to drain the swamp and disrupt the status quo.
Exactly. And, what's chilling is that Russia understood this dynamic and exploited it masterfully. They used social media to micro-target specific demographics, particularly white working-class voters who felt left behind by globalization and economic change, and they preyed on their fears, their resentments, and their sense of nostalgia for this bygone era.
And they offered up scapegoats, right?
Yeah.
Immigrants, minorities, elites, globalists, anyone perceived as a threat to their way of life. It's a really disturbing example of how propaganda can prey on these existing societal vulnerabilities to undermine democratic values.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that democracy is fragile, and it requires constant vigilance and active participation to safeguard it.
Right. Snyder's book is a powerful warning. He argues that this politics of eternity seeks to create a world where truth is subjective, history is malleable, and power is concentrated in the hands of, a select few. It's a world where those democratic values that we hold dear, like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the rule of law, are eroded and ultimately replaced by authoritarianism and control.
So, what can we do? Snyder offers some potential solutions. He argues that we need to strengthen our democratic institutions, promote critical thinking, and become much more discerning consumers of information.
Yeah, be aware of our own biases and prejudices and how those can be exploited.
Exactly. We need to hold our leaders accountable regardless of their political affiliation.
This deep dive has been, a sobering exploration of the challenges facing democracy in the 21st century. But if you want to understand how these tactics of manipulation and disinformation are being used and learn how to resist them, I strongly encourage you to read The Road to Unfreedom. It's a dense book, but it's a rewarding one, and it will stay with you long after you finish reading it.